The Chernobyl disaster of April 26, 1986 was a nuclear accident that happened in the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which was being run by the authorities of the Soviet Union. An explosion released a substantial amount of radioactive substances into the atmosphere that was dispersed over a great deal of Western USSR and Europe. The Chernobyl disaster is considered to be the worst nuclear power plant disaster and is one of the two that are classified as a level 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The fight to contain the explosion to prevent greater catastrophe and the incorporated more than 500,000 people and spent over 18 billion rubles, which is their currency. The catastrophe started on Saturday, April 26, 1986, at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl plant during a routine system test. There was an unanticipated power increase, and when the emergency shutdown was attempted, an enormous surge in power output took place. The consequences of this spike in energy led to a reactor vessel burst and a chain of steam explosions. These incidents caused the graphite moderator part of the reactor to come into contact with air, causing it to ignite. The fire sent a huge cloud of highly reactive fallout, which is commonly known as black rain, into the atmosphere and over a large geographical area. Followed is the remaining radioactive material pushed into the upper atmosphere. This cloud of debris was carried over a large part of Western Soviet Union and Europe. From 1986 to 2000, over 350,400 people were evacuated and relocated from their homes, which were in the most affected areas of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine.
27th at 11 a.m., the population of the town Pripyat, not far from Chernobyl, was told that it was going to be evacuated. 2.5 hours later, all the inhabitants, along with friends, people living in the neighborhood, cats and dogs, had left their homes for good. The evacuation was progressively extended to include people living within a 30-kilometer radius of the reactor. This brought the total number of evacuees to about 116,000. In the years following the accident, the number of the people that were forced to relocate grew to 330,000. Can you imagine the psychological damage caused by this forced evacuation and relocation? Not only among the resettled people, but also among the residents of the areas of resettlement. These people feared and highly disapproved the mass of arrivals of busloads of contaminated foreigners. All the forced relocation gave rise to mental health problems, alcohol, and tobacco abuse. Eventually, some of the formerly evacuated areas were resettled, but that was only until much later.
Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus have been strained with the decontamination and healthcare costs due to the Chernobyl accident. 20 years after the incident occurred, the cost had multiplied, exceeding hundreds of billions of dollars. It was estimated at $300 billion, and it's still increasing. Some areas in which the money was spent was to the direct damage caused by the accident, to sealing off the reactor zone, relocating over 300,000 people, healthcare, radiation monitoring, toxic waste cleanup, and disposal of radioactive waste. Ukraine has been spending 5 to 7% of its annual budget on Chernobyl-induced events, and Belarus has been spending over 20%. Chernobyl depended greatly on agriculture. Their agricultural sector was the area of the economy that sustained the worst damage from the accident. A total of 784,320 hectares of agricultural land was contaminated, and the production was stopped over 694,200 hectares of the forest. The fallout had a huge impact on vegetation, rivers, lakes, and groundwater. It had caused severe radioactive damage to the ecological balance to the region for decades. The second major cloud of radiation from the Chernobyl accident drifted directly over the red forest. The radioactive particles landed on the trees, killing roughly 400 hectares of pine forest. The red forest is now one of the most contaminated human environments on the planet. Primary contamination of the groundwater is possibly caused by the method of disposal used to the red forest. The majority of the contaminated forest was bulldozed and buried in the trenches and then covered. As the trees decomposed, the radiation slowly leaked into the groundwater, contaminating it. Aside from all the contamination in these zones, wildlife is abundant in the most affected areas, even less than 20 years after the incident.
The Chernobyl disaster showed the ugly face of nuclear power, the one the nuclear industry is trying to hide. The accident had caused serious social and psychological disruption to the lives of those who'd been affected by it. It was considered to have been the worst nuclear power plant accident in history. Of 600 workers present on the site during the early morning of April 26th, 134 of them received high dose and suffered immediate radiation sickness. Among these 134, 31 died within the first 3 months following the accident, and another 19 in the years that followed, of various causes that are not necessarily associated with their exposure to radiation. By 2008, 64 people had died of radiation. The Chernobyl Forum estimated that the number of deaths could eventually reach 4,000 among those who had been exposed to the highest levels of radiation. 2,000 emergency workers, 116,000 evacuees, and 270,000 residents had been among these the most contaminated areas. Large areas of the three countries, Belarus, the Russian Federation, as well as Ukraine, had been contaminated with radioactive materials and radionuclides. All the released radiation caused health problems to the residents of the three countries. It has been proven that many of the cancers among the residents were caused by high radiation exposures shortly after the accident. However, there is no scientific evidence of increases in overall mortality rates or non-malignant disorders that could have been related to radiation exposure. Those most highly exposed individuals are obviously at an increased risk of radiation-associated effects. The radionuclides released from the reactor that caused exposure of individuals were mainly iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137. Iodine-131 has a short radioactive half-life, but it can be transferred to humans relatively quickly in the air and through consumption of contaminated products. The exposures were much higher for those involved in mitigating the effects of the accidents and those who resided nearby. The Union of Concerned Scientists estimates that among the millions of people living in broader geographical areas, there will be 50,000 excess cancer cases, resulting in 25,000 excess cancer deaths.
The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, had begun creating agreements on international cooperation and emergency assistance in case of a nuclear accident. This discussion had begun after the 3 Mile Island scare in 1979, but eventually these ideas were deemed unachievable. The Chernobyl disaster gave them a reason to create these agreements, and others, which will eventually be accepted. 4 months after the accident, the following conventions were created: the Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident, and the Convention on Assistance in the Case of a Nuclear Accident or Radiological Emergency. These were a few of the first conventions created after the first disaster at Chernobyl.
The accident at Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986 was a tragic event for its victims, and those most affected suffered major hardship. Some of the people who dealt with the emergency lost their lives. Although those exposed as children and emergency and recovery workers are increased risk of radio-induced effects, the vast majority of the population need not live in fear of serious health consequences due to the radiation from the Chernobyl accident. For the most part, they were exposed to radiation levels comparable to or a few times higher than annual levels of natural background and future exposures. Lives have been seriously disrupted by the Chernobyl accident, but from the radiological point of view, generally positive prospects for the future health of most individuals should prevail.
Did you know that workers cleaning up were allowed to work on the site for a maximum of 10 minutes to minimize their exposure time? It was later discovered that every single one of these workers died as a result of radiation.